I love how you can tell if I'm filming during the week or on the weekend by how bedraggled I look. In case you were wondering, it's currently in the middle of the week. But anyway, hello everybody and welcome back to a new video. My name is Sarah and today we are going to be doing my September wrap up. So if you're wondering why I'm kind of in a different location, Connor had a really long day and he's currently sleeping, and so I didn't want to wake him up and make him move so that I could film, so I just went out in the other room. So in September I ended up reading 6 books. I feel like I could have maybe squeezed in one more, but September was a month where 2 of my newest current obsessions were introduced. I started watching Jujutsu Kaisen. I'm only about a little over halfway through, but I started watching that and then I started playing Genshin Impact, which has revived my love for video games. It's a little different than when I normally play. I used to play a lot of PvP games, but I'm loving the story mode. Anyway, I feel like if those 2 didn't get introduced, I could have maybe read 7, but that's fine. I'm enjoying other things, which is good. So the first book that I read in September is The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner. This is a historical fiction novel and we follow 2 different timelines. So we follow one in the late 1700s where we're following an apothecary who deals with women's ailments but specializes in procuring poisons for women to use against men who have wronged them. And then in present day, we follow a young woman who is in London and recently learned about her husband's infidelity. And so while in London, she actually stumbles across one of these apothecary bottles and then kind of goes down this rabbit hole to kind of figure out the story of the apothecary and kind of what happened with all of these unknown apothecary murders. And so as we follow both timelines, we kind of learn the whole story, obviously what actually happened, and then how our present day historian kind of figures out what happened. And overall, like, I enjoyed this book, but it definitely felt like one that is pretty forgettable for me, to be honest. Like, it was a very entertaining story. I was surprised with how much this kind of had to do with themes of like fertility and motherhood, which was very interesting. I wasn't expecting that. And I definitely liked the past timeline a lot better. It was definitely a lot more high stakes, which makes sense because, you know, at the year following, the apothecary during the events that are happening, and you're following her as she is meeting with her newest client, who turns out to be a very young girl. And you know, so it's very high stakes and very interesting, while as in the present day, you're more just following this woman as she's slowly piecing things together herself. But I thought that Penner did a very good job balancing the 2 timelines to still make the present day timeline interesting to read about. It definitely took a turn at the end in both the present and past timelines that I wasn't expecting. There was definitely something that happened to characters in both timelines that I was impressed with, kind of that decision of the author to make. However, I did not like the fantastical element that got brought into the story towards the end. I just felt like that element was not necessary, because throughout the entire story, like, we're dealing with, you know, real world apothecary poisons, things that, like, you know, are believable to happen in our world, and then that fantastical element that gets added at the end just really did not fit for me, and I just really did not like it at all. And I also felt like it kind of dampened the effect that one of the earlier decisions that the author made for one of the characters would have had if that decision kind of stayed the way it was when it was first made. That this magical element kind of reversed it. I don't know. I wasn't a huge fan of that. But overall, like I said, I enjoyed the book. Besides that, but I think it's like gonna be one of those pretty forgettable stories for me. But I did end up giving it 3 stars. And then after that, I picked up Becky Chambers' first book in the Wayfarers series, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and I absolutely adored this book. So this is a science fiction novel, and it's the first, like I said, the first in a series, and this series is kind of described as cozy science fiction, and I think it's really good to kind of keep in mind that it's like a slice of life science fiction. So we follow a group of almost like space construction workers. They live on this ship where they kind of punch wormholes between different spaces in outer space, between different planets and different space stations in order to make kind of like fast travel highways through space. So we follow this team as they acquire a new member who you can tell right away is running from something from her past, but they don't know what it is, and you as a reader don't know what it is until later in the book. And then they also book a new job which is going to definitely pay out a lot of money, but it's very high risk job. It's very dangerous. And so the story is kind of leading up to them doing this job. It's them traveling all the way out to where the wormhole needs to be punched, and then the actual like job itself doesn't happen until the end of the story. And so the entire book leading up to that is, like I said, them traveling, and you're just kind of like following these characters as they go about their day-to-day lives. I think if you go into it knowing that it's very slow paced, it's very character focused, there's not a lot of action until, you know, the end, and even then there's not a lot, but it's just a very quiet novel focused around very vibrant characters. I think you will definitely enjoy it. I had a lot of fun with this. I absolutely adored all of the characters. Becky Chambers does a really good job of giving you a very vibrant picture of who these characters are within just a few pieces of dialogue, and then delving into them even further as the story goes on. This book also just kind of quietly looks at like what it means to be different, and kind of like different perspectives on humanity and what makes somebody a human or a person. And it just puts it in a lens of like humans and alien life. Like I said, it's just a very quiet book, but it's definitely a very heartwarming one. It's funny. It surprised me with making me cry at the end. I was not expecting it, and I was not expecting this one event to happen at the end, especially with how like overall uplifting the rest of the story had been, but I was definitely impressed that Chambers made that decision to have this event happen, and it was literally just one piece of dialogue that immediately had me crying. And I am a crybaby when it comes to books, but I was not expecting to be punched in the gut that hard with one piece of dialogue, and I definitely was impressed. And I'm really looking forward to continuing this series because, like I said, it just felt like very uplifting and heartwarming as an overall book. And yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I gave it 4 stars. Then after that, I read another kind of sci-fi dystopian novel, although it has a very, very different tone, and that is Born by Jeff Vandermeer. This is the first book in the Born series. It does have another full-length novel after this one, and a novella in between this one and the full-length novel. I have really enjoyed Jeff Vandermeer's works that I've read so far. I've read the Southern Reach trilogy, and then also Hummingbird Salamander before this one. And this is definitely pretty different than those books. It has a similar tone of like environmental horror and environmental science fiction that his other works have, but it just definitely felt very different. So in this book, we're in a post-apocalyptic city and we're following a woman named Rachel. She is kind of a scavenger in this city, and one day she stumbles across this like weird organic mass that she can't tell if it's a plant or an animal, some sort of creature, but it exudes this kind of comforting feeling, and so she ends up taking it home with her, and then that kind of causes a domino effect that disrupts the power balance of this city that's already being ruled by this Godzilla-sized flying bear. There's also another character called the Magician, and she's kind of in the background for the beginning of this book as like kind of a person that's trying to usurp the bear. And yeah, it's just like a really crazy story. I don't really know how else to explain what actually happens in this book. Vandermeer has a very unique way of writing things. It's very almost psychedelic. Like for a lot of this book, you're not really sure exactly what's going on, and I feel like it's a common theme in his stories, and it ends up happening in this one where you don't get the entire picture of like what's happening because your main characters don't get the entire picture of what's happening. You only know what your main characters end up learning, and like I feel like he does it in a way where it feels realistic, because like your main characters aren't these all-powerful people who are going to solve a problem or learn everything about like what's going on in the world around them, and it just feels very realistic for like an average person just trying to survive. Because of that, it's not very disappointing that you don't get all of the answers, and I actually kind of enjoy that about his writing. So I definitely think my biggest issue with his story was the pacing. I could never get like a very solid footing in the pacing of this story, and I think I just, because I struggled to really like get into the flow of the story, I definitely didn't sink into it all the way. I felt like I was kind of like fighting against the pacing of the story the entire time I was reading this, and I think it definitely hindered my enjoyment of it, but I did enjoy the story. Like it is very just otherworldly and creepy. The unknown is so creepy, like not knowing like who or what this like creature is, and then there's like weird feral children that are severely altered physically, and they're just very, very unsettling. But yeah, I definitely enjoyed it, and I will be continuing the series, but it's not my favorite of Vandermeer's works that I've read so far, but I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. And then after that, I picked up a young adult fantasy standalone, and that is For Dead Queens by Astrid Schultz. So this book is centered in a queendom that is ruled by 4 queens. They kind of each rule their own separate quadrant, but they work cohesively together. And each quadrant kind of has its own specialized culture and productivity, I guess. Like you've got one culture based on technology, another on like agriculture. It definitely took me back to my Divergent trilogy days, but more in like a nostalgia way than in a bad way, because it still felt different. In this story, we follow 2 main characters. One is a thief and the other is more of like an upstanding citizen, working as a messenger. And one day the thief goes to steal the messenger's message that they have to deliver, and as the messenger is trying to get his kind of package back, the 2 characters end up gaining this knowledge of the death of the 4 queens, and so then they have to kind of work to solve the mystery of who the killer is of these 4 queens. So I enjoyed this book and I found it entertaining. I liked the world building a lot, and I enjoyed the queens especially, particularly kind of how devoted they were to each of their quadrants, but how they each had kind of a very specific things that they were battling with personally throughout the story, and I liked how we got to see from their perspectives. We do flip between our two main characters, our thief and our messenger, but we also do get to see from the perspectives of each of the queens as well. So we do a lot of bouncing around in this book, and I found that the queens had a lot of like personality, and it was very fascinating to read about their different quadrants. The thief and the messenger were okay. I didn't mind them, but I definitely think they could have used more TLC in order to give them, I guess, a little more of a personality that didn't feel so cardboard-esque. I was really impressed with what Schultz tried to do with this book and kind of what she tried to do with the big twist in the mystery. However, I don't think it was pulled off effectively. The kind of explanation as to how the twist would have came to be and like the logic behind it just didn't quite fit. It wasn't quite believable. I felt like it was just kind of like a thing that was thrown in as like a, yeah, this is a new thing or whatever. It just felt like she just threw it in to make the whole thing work, and I was kind of disappointed in that. And kind of besides how interesting I found the queens and the quadrants, and like I still felt like there could have been more to them. You know, this is just a standalone novel, but I felt like Schultz really could have went somewhere with this world and kind of delved a lot deeper into a lot of different things. Overall, it did feel pretty surface level, which is pretty standard for YA, but I would be interested to kind of see what else Schultz writes, because like I said, I did find it really impressive what she was trying to do with this, but in the end I did end up giving it 2.5 stars. And then the 5th book that I read was The Wolf of Orion by K.S. Veloso, and this book really took me by surprise. I was incredibly impressed with it. So this is a book that has kind of a complicated synopsis to it. It is a political fantasy. We follow our queen Talion. So she is the daughter of the now dead clan leader who had taken his clan and kind of started a civil war in the country. And in order for a truce to happen, the clan leader promised Queen Talion's hand in marriage to the heir of the rival clan, which is the clan that's more liked by the rest of the clans. So on Queen Talion's kind of day of her coronation, her and her husband's coronation, she is said to have killed a man and banished her husband. And so, of course, there's more to the story than that, and you find out later in the book kind of more details of what actually happened. And so 5 years after her coronation, she has been ruling this land as the sole queen, the sole ruler, and she gets a letter from her estranged husband who is kind of chilling out in this other kingdom and is like, hey, we should meet up. You need to come to this kingdom so that we can meet and kind of discuss what we want to do with kind of us being king and queen and our marriage and everything going forward. And so she agrees to meet him in this other kingdom. And while there, a bunch of stuff happens during this meeting, one of which is an assassination attempt, which she escapes, but then she finds herself completely alone in this kingdom that doesn't want her there, as she tries to kind of figure out what the heck is going on with her husband and all of these other people, and kind of try to figure out how to find her way back to her own kingdom that doesn't want her there either. And this is a very complicated political fantasy. So if you're new to political fantasies, I definitely think that you might struggle getting into it. But if you love political fantasies, I think you will love this book, because it is so interesting how we follow Queen Talion and how she maneuvers different situations and definitely like how she maneuvers different situations in a land that she's completely new to. We get a few flashbacks to kind of how she works with like her own people, but mostly it's like her riding by the seat of her pants, trying to figure out her next move and constantly being thwarted by dangers from all over the place. It's very, very fascinating. I loved how Talion was written. She is definitely like a very badass queen, and she's written as like this tough, no nonsense, I'll chop your head off if you look at me wrong kind of woman. But there's like a whole other side to her that you as a reader get to see, but nobody else really gets to see, because she has to hide it in order to kind of keep her, you know, power and stuff, in order to have people take her seriously and not overthrow her. And it was just, she's a very well fleshed out character. The one issue I had with this book that kept me from making it a 5-star read was how utterly confusing the first chapter was, and then certain points throughout the book were also very confusing. And I kind of think that this has to do with how this book was originally independently published, so maybe there wasn't a big editing team behind this book in order to kind of help restructure the first chapter to make it better to follow. It has been since picked up by, I think, Orbit Books. It has republished it. But just the whole structuring of the first chapter had me completely lost, and I actually had to go back and read the synopsis again in order to really pick up what the heck was going on. But besides that, after the first chapter, it definitely gets a lot easier to follow, and I highly, highly recommend reading this and checking this book out. I'm going to end up giving it 4 stars. And then the final book that I read during the month of September was A Reaper at the Gates by Sabaa Tahir. This is the 3rd book in the Ember Quartet series, the first book being An Ember in the Ashes, and since this is the 3rd book, I'm not going to tell you what this one is about. But the first book is set in a militaristic empire. We follow 2 main characters, Leia and Elias. So one day Leia's family home gets raided and her brother gets arrested, and so she enlists the help of a rebel group in order to break her brother out of prison. But they only agree to help if she agrees to infiltrate the military academy and act as their spy. And so if she agrees to do that, and while she's there, she meets Elias, who is one of their top students, but also one of their most reluctant, and he has been looking to escape the academy, and just kind of run away right around his time of graduation. And kind of the 2 of them meeting, and then the graduation of the current class at this military academy ends up being kind of catalysts for a whole bunch of events, and that's where our story begins. And so this is the 3rd book, and this, just like the other first 2, are addictively fast-paced. I actually think that the high intensity of the pacing didn't suit the first one super well. I feel like there's a couple points that could have been fleshed out a bit more, but I think it fits this book so well. It was just every chapter ends and like something big is happening. So during the 2nd book, A Torch Against the Night, we actually get a 3rd character's perspective introduced. Helene, she was in the first book, but we didn't necessarily read from her perspective, and that does continue in this book as well. We follow Leia, Elias, and Helene. We cycle through chapters told from their different perspectives, and in this book they are each doing wildly different things, but each of their stories are just as compelling to read, which was very enjoyable because, sometimes you get books with more than just like 1 or 2 perspectives, and there always seems to be a perspective that's not as interesting to read as the others, but I really think that all 3 of them were just as interesting and addictive to read. This book definitely kept me on my toes a lot. We are fully steeped in kind of the magic magic of this whole story. In the first book, we don't get a whole lot of like magic fantastical elements. They're kind of hinted at and make minor appearances. They definitely get introduced and solidified in the second book, and here we are absolutely steeped in it. And I really enjoyed it. It was really interesting to read. There's just so many moving parts in this book, which I found to be super impressive in a YA fantasy series. Definitely the level of detail and kind of the number of layers to this whole overall story reminds me of something that you would find more in adult fantasy. There have been some really interesting turns to several of the characters, and I've been kind of impressed with how Tahir kind of like starts moving certain characters in like relationships in predictable patterns and then completely thwarts them. I found that really impressive, and their kind of story arcs are not as like standard for YA, but still just as enjoyable. And I am definitely looking forward. I'm looking forward to, but I'm scared of how this series is going to end, because I've come to really enjoy these characters and this story overall, but I did give this one 4 stars. So those are the 6 books that I read in September. I felt like this wrap-up was kind of a bit jumbled. I felt like I kind of lost my kind of train of thought and my cohesiveness to a lot of my thoughts and my organization. So I apologize that this may not have been my strongest wrap-up, but thank you for bearing with me and sticking with me. I'd love to hear in the comments if you've read any of these books or if you're looking to read any of them. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you consider sticking around and subscribing, but as always, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!